Barry Jenkins is one of the most interesting filmmakers working today. He's one of the best and most humanist storytellers working in Hollywood right now, crafting tales rooted in true human emotion. He was at the center of one of the most famous moments in the history of the Academy Awards. He's made Moonlight, If Beale Street Could Talk, and directed the entirety of the Underground Railroad at Amazon. He is a generational talent. And this is his next film. In the interest of fairness, we should concede that Jenkins has made it very clear in publicity that he has a great deal of affinity for The Lion King and that he's excited to direct Mufasa. But it's hard not to feel like this is some sort of divine justice or cosmic penance for the fact that nobody went to see If Beale Street Could Talk in cinemas.
You don't have a problem with that?
Well, my strong suspicion is we get the world we deserve.
The trailer for Mufasa arrived last week, and it offered a glimpse into the Uncanny Valley, the latest in the long line of ostensibly live-action adaptations of classic Disney animation. So this seems like as good an opportunity as ever to talk about that wave of movies, why they exist, what they represent, and why they fundamentally do not work. Sure, these movies make a lot of money, but they don't really get great reviews, and they don't really linger in the consciousness as independentes quite separate from the movies that inspired them. So join us this week, as we have an animated discussion about Disney's live-action adaptations. To be fair, it is worth acknowledging that these pseudo-live-action remakes are not entirely new. During the 1990s, Disney invested in two separate live-action remakes of The Jungle Book, and produced a fairly successful live-action remake of 101 Dalmatians starring Glenn Close that even spawned a sequel. However, these were aberrations. They were not business as usual. The modern wave of remakes really began with Tim Burton's live-action remake of Alice in Wonderland in 2010. Of course, we put the words live-action in quotes back there, because the bulk of this movie was made inside a computer. This is true of a lot of the remakes that followed, to the point that Jon Favreau shot his version of The Lion King inside what he termed virtual reality. So when people use the term live action to describe these films, what they typically mean is photorealistic or verisimilitudinous. These are movies that have the effect of live action, they feature characters who look more like human beings or animals than cartoons, and they take place inside environments that look like they could exist in three-dimensional space. Burton's Alice in Wonderland was the first example of the form, but it was also an outlier in that it was actually remarkably different from the animated film of the same name. In fact, it had the texture of a Tim Burton movie, for better and, well, mostly for worse, and a plot that was fairly disconnected from the earlier classic. The film went on to gross over $1 billion and was the second highest grossing movie of the year at the global box office. Disney realized quite quickly that this was going to be a very profitable mode in which they could operate. It helps that the company's live-action film division was going through something of a crisis. Despite the early success with the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, Disney was struggling to generate internal intellectual property, with an eye to attracting older audiences. This led to a string of hugely embarrassing box office bombs for the studio's live-action department. And this created the impression that Disney was not a company that could grow potentially new, or at least new to customer, brands internally. And look, in case you're curious, The Lone Ranger has somehow aged even worse than you might have imagined.
He cut out his heart. What kind of a man does something like that?
The company partially resolved this issue by just buying Marvel and Lucasfilm outright, effectively outsourcing a lot of their forward-looking intellectual property plays to smaller companies with established brands. This left open the question of what Disney's own brand in live-action filmmaking was going to be. The success of Alice in Wonderland set a blueprint. The company could exploit its existing intellectual property. To be fair, at least some of these early adaptations had a distinctive perspective and style. They drew on the source material in interesting ways, using familiar iconography and ideas to tell stories that felt at least somewhat novel within the context of the Walt Disney Company. Unfortunately, these movies were outperformed by more literal-minded and direct adaptations that saw primarily transpose the classic cartoons into live action with minimal divergence. That wave of films was incredibly faithful to the earlier animated movies, to the point that they were occasionally shot-for-shot or even line-for-line translations of those animated movies into a photorealistic mode. Indeed, they're arguably interesting in the same way that Gus Van Sant's infamously ill-advised remake of Psycho is interesting, as a sort of pop art study of the limits of textual fidelity and adaptation. Contrary to what large portions of the internet will tell you, just because something is faithful to the source material doesn't mean it's actually good. Beyond the obvious profit motive, it's interesting to wonder why Disney opted for this approach. For decades, the studio cultivated a steady revenue stream by just re-releasing the animated classics in cinemas and absorbing passive income. They re-released Song of the South as recently as 1986.
Walt Disney's Song of the South. My oh my, what a wonderful movie.
These adaptations serve a similar purpose, but they tap into the extent to which modern blockbusters have grown so large that they have to be 4-quadrant hits. They have to appeal to men and women, young and old. It's no longer enough to make one movie for adults and one movie for kids, so parents can drop their kids to one film and go see another. Now every member of the family has to see every film together. Why earn millions on re-releases when you can earn billions on remakes? The nostalgia associated with the brand pulls in adults who remember these movies fondly from their childhoods. After all, the Disney adult is an archetype unto itself. As such, these films played very well to older audiences, nostalgic for the films that they loved as children. According to Deadline, for example, the opening weekend of Beauty and the Beast in 2017 was split almost evenly between those under and those over 25 years of age. However, if you look at Statistica, over the long term, that audience skewed significantly older. This explains the two competing and paradoxical impulses within these live-action adaptations. They are shot-for-shot and line-for-line remakes of the animated classic in order to tap into that same nostalgia that Disney's been mining for the past decade. However, they are in live-action rather than animation, and they often run to 2 hours rather than a tight 80 minutes, because they're aimed at an older American audience. Now, we need to be careful not to generalize here, because around the world, animation is respected as a medium unto itself. One that can tell all sorts of stories intended for all sorts of audiences. However, in American pop culture, animation is largely seen as a medium for children. There are exceptions, of course, but many of those play into the underlying assumption that animation is aimed at children in order to be transgressive or subversive.
That movie has warped my fragile little mind.
Of course, recent years have seen some pushback on the idea, but it still holds strong in the mainstream. As a result, these movies are photorealistic and they're overextended in an effort to appeal to adults who love the originals as children, but who might feel embarrassed to buy a ticket to an animated movie on a date night, or even with their friends. This is the main marketing gimmick of these movies. It's also why they don't work at all. Narratively, animated films are constructed like clockwork. Because animation is so arduous, it costs so much and it takes so much time, animated films are often tightly plotted and structured before any actual illustration begins. As such, they tend to be very efficient machines. There's rarely any fat on them. For example, the company Pixar is as famous for their approach to storytelling as they are for their technical innovation. As a result, many of these animated movies are perfectly proportioned. They don't have any gaps into which more plot might be inserted, at least not without fundamentally reworking the material, which these movies are reluctant to do because that would break the nostalgia. So when the studio decides that a once 80-minute movie now needs to run to 2 hours, that means adding a whole bunch of superfluous material that cannot impact the actual shape of the core narrative being told because it needs to look exactly like it did 25 years ago. Sometimes, this effort to pad out the movie leads to dead-end plots, like giving Belle's mother an entire backstory, or giving the genie a love interest, or explaining that Cruella de Vil is evil and hates Dalmatians because a Dalmatian killed her mother. Sometimes this just leads to the decision to arrive at scenes earlier and leave them later than in the original, which, and look, it's hard to describe this to somebody who has not seen the remake of The Lion King. But there are moments where that film seems to be drawing more heavily from something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail than it does from the original Lion King. Except, not funny. The result is a lot of dead air. And yes, that was a second wind joke. These aren't narrative choices, they're marketing justifications. The other big issue is more fundamental and formal. Traditional animation is a different medium than film, and it has different strengths. Animated figures can be exaggerated. Animated animals can be anthropomorphized. Unburdened by the constraints of reality, lions can be given big, expressive eyes and wide, articulate jaws that make it easier for animators to communicate emotion in ways that a human being can recognize or understand. In contrast, the faces of photorealistic big cats are not designed to be readable to humans. Trust me, even the most enthusiastic cat owner on the planet will tell you how difficult it is to figure out what's going on behind those eyes. So, when you look at Scar in animation, you immediately know what he's thinking. Hell, you can even read his body language from the way that he's drawn. However, when you see him in photorealistic quote-unquote live action, he just looks like he's appearing in a David Attenborough documentary. The same is true of inanimate objects, which can be given personalities and expression through animation, while rendering them in a quote-unquote realistic manner makes them less expressive and less compelling. There's a reason that these stories were so perfectly suited to the medium of animation, and why they became so beloved in that form. Those reasons don't translate cleanly into photorealistic filmmaking. For example, animation could famously keep pace with Robin Williams' runaway stream of consciousness riffing, whereas in live action the genie always looks like Will Smith. Hell, he's rarely even allowed to be blue. It's inherently less magical. Even the color schemes and the landscapes become less expressive in the pursuit of verisimilitude, while big musical set pieces are toned down to make them look more quote-unquote plausible. It's an approach that strips everything that audiences loved about the original film out of the remakes, to the point that these films conjure nothing but the memory of beloved childhood classics. Of course, in a broader sense, this is how Disney has operated over the past decade, ruthlessly mining an audience's nostalgia for familiar iconography with little consideration for what made those original projects so effective in the first place. It's cultural fracking, an attempt to extract maximum financial value from established properties as quickly as possible, with little concern for the long-term damage caused in the process. 2 of these remakes grossed over $1 billion each in 2019, a year in which Disney harnessed its intellectual property to make more money in the first 7 months of the year than any other studio had made in any year ever. It might be creatively bankrupt, but it certainly creates bank. To be fair, there is some sense that audiences are at last growing tired of this approach, as demonstrated by the bombing of Mulan, the minimal cultural impact of streaming releases of Pinocchio and Peter Pan and Wendy, or even the relative underperformance of The Little Mermaid. Indeed, even from this vantage point, there is a sense that Mufasa won't be the first sequel to a Disney movie that made over $1 billion in 2019 to underperform.
Is that like a personal attack or something? Or...
Audiences loved these original animated films because they were joyous, they were vibrant, they were dynamic, they were exciting. Because they used the form of animation to express ideas and concepts in a way that simply was not possible in any other format. Advances in CGI might extend what's possible, but when you're using those tools to emulate reality, you end up taking a lot of the life out of these stories. They become a little less animated. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.